Great. So first of all, thank you all so much for joining us. This is our third virtual tasting for Klein Cellars. We've had a lot of fun the past 2 times and we've tasted a lot of great wines. And we were excited to put together these 3. I think they're really great holiday wines, part of the reason that we chose these. And yeah, we're really excited to be with you all virtually. It's a really nice way to connect with everyone. Before we jump into the fun part, I do want to make sure I introduce myself. For those of you who haven't joined us before, my name is Megan Cline. I'm part of the 2nd generation here at Klein Family Cellars. And I have been working with my family for the past 5 years now. But before that was a sommelier down in Santa Barbara, and then decided if I wanted to work in wine, Sonoma was definitely the place to be. And so came back, and now I do a little bit of everything with my family. So everything from working in the cellar and the vineyard with our winemaker, Charlie, to working with our hospitality team, our marketing team. And I think that's the great thing about working with the family is that no 2 days are ever the same. You're never bored, that is for sure. So it's always really fun. And I am so happy to be with you all here today. And also with us on this virtual tasting, we have our wonderful, wonderful winemaker, Mr. Charlie Tsegeletos.
Hi, everybody.
And Charlie has been with us for the past 19 years. Our wonderful winemaker has really developed our style here at Klein, our winemaking style, and has made a huge impact. And Charlie, I would love to have you tell us a little bit about your history in the wine world and all that good stuff.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm born and raised in Northern California in Marin County. I grew up, I've got a Greek American dad and an Italian American mother. So there was always plenty of alcoholic beverages, wine and other things on the table for me to taste and learn how to drink and enjoy. I went off to UC Davis and graduated with a plant science, ag science degree in '79, and then took a job as an apprentice winemaker at a tiny little winery down in San Jose. From there, I moved to the next winery and was an assistant winemaker, and then I joined a large winery called Glen Ellen, and I became the director of winemaking for that operation, and I was there for 15 years. And then that winery sold and moved away, and I took my bag of wines and visited Fred, and he bought the story and hired me 19 harvests ago. And the neat thing is, when I was with the really large winery, we had a large research budget. So we were able to take a look at a lot of different blends that were highly successful in the market and kind of deconstruct them and say, hey, what's going on? And I learned that some minor things can make a big difference in moving the needle from a B+ to an A-, that kind of thing, the perception of quality. And they can be things as simple as wine during fermentation, sugar converts into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So you've got some natural carbon dioxide in there. Now you can sparge it out with a nitrogen gas and get rid of that carbon dioxide. Or if you leave in a red wine 600 parts per million, it's under bubbly threshold. You don't pick it up on your tongue, but it gives the wine some life. So it's simple things like that, like knowing the amount of naturally occurring carbon dioxide that you want to keep in your wine can make a difference to the wine. So everything I learned with the big guys in our big research budget translated wonderfully to the great unique grapes that we're growing at Klein Cellars. You know, I didn't see a lot of Mourvedre or Carignan before I joined Klein, but you know, I love those, and it's going to be fun getting a chance to taste them with you.
Thanks, Charlie. So some of you guys may have noticed this guy here in my frame, and this is our special guest for the day. This is my father, Fred Cline. And those of you who have joined us before, you know, we always go through a little bit of a history of Klein, how we got started, just, you know, for the people who may not know. And what better way to hear the history than from the man himself, my dad. So he started the winery back in 1982. And from there, I will kind of pass it off to you to tell us a little bit about your history and your journey to making Klein what it is today.
Okay, well, I'll start by saying that I started drinking wine very young. but with my grandfather, who was an Italian immigrant, and his name was Valeriano Cuvee of the Cuvee family, which is why we have a second winery called Cuvee Family Vineyards. But I drank wine not to get drunk, but to just taste it. My grandfather would give us a little bit of wine in a water glass, and then put the rest, fill the rest of the glass with water, and that was just very interesting way to have a meal. You'd have that with the meal, and you had it straight, it was kind of sweet, so we kind of liked that too. But we just got to really tasting it, and then in my later years, I ended up moving in with my grandparents. I started in Southern California,
Right, yeah.
and moved up to Northern California where my grandparents were, and actually started helping my grandfather make wine. And when he passed away, I stayed up with my grandmother and took care of her and continued the winemaking process, and never thought I was going to be in the wine business, but I did go to UC Davis. I took some enology classes and viticulture classes, and I just really wanted to be a farmer. But it turns out that I graduated from Davis and was working in all different types of ag at the time, including a sod farm, raising almonds. And we also were clearing out old dead orchards that people wanted out of their way, mostly walnuts and almonds that were really old. And so we had a little side wood business. Well, one of those properties that we went to had a winery on it. It hadn't been used in over 35 years, but it was called the Old Furpo Winery. And I looked at the building and I go, I understand everything there. There was all these redwood open top fermenters. There were some big oak barrels. There was a big press that was much bigger than my grandfather's, and it had hydraulics on it versus my grandfather's, which was just a ratchet press. And so I thought about it, and I ended up talking to the wife of whose husband had passed away and left this, and said, would you be interested in leasing that? And she said, okay. And we ended up creating a lease, and I started out in Oakley, California in an old barn, and spent a lot of years and a lot of hours fixing the barn, insulating it, repairing everything that needed to be repaired, and getting some other barrels, new barrels, and started making wine and trying to sell it. Now, making it wasn't as hard as selling it, but it was, I started to get a little bit of traction, and we started selling some wine, and I used brokers in the beginning, either myself or then we had a couple of brokers, and then we finally got my brother to join me, and Matt Klein, and he ended up staying with us for about 15 or 16 years, and then he spun off and started his own winery. But as we were growing, I fell in love with this young lady's mother, and my wife Nancy and I got married, and very quickly had our first child, and she was working up in Marin County, and I was in Oakley, and that was about a good hour. Back then it was only about an hour away, but we decided that since she was really making the money and I was mostly spending it and just trying to make money, that we found a place in Martinez halfway between the winery and her work, and then that was going around all right. And then pretty soon she was expecting again with number 2, and she said, you're not making enough money for now you got to move up to where I'm working. And so we did. We moved, and we found this piece in Sonoma, this beautiful piece of property.
I'm gonna share my screen also, because I think it's a good visual of what the winery looks like, what it used to be, and some of the jacuzzi history in there as well. So for those of you who have been to Klein, it is a really wonderful historic property. The tasting room looks completely different than this lower left-hand photo here, but this is what it looked like when you guys moved to that property, correct?
That's correct. That was the tasting room, or that was a house. And if you see, it's pretty low to the ground. And when we bought this property, it was known as the Salt Ranch, and it had been kind of abandoned for the last few years before we had bought it. And so when we bought it, we had a lot of work there to do, but I was young and really ready to do anything I needed to do. And we were able to convert. There was a horse arena on it, as well as horse stalls, which that big arena now is our main tank room and some of our barrel fermenting area. And
I do think the coolest part of this story and the way that you guys have told it is my mom grew up in Marin, but she grew up riding horses. And when she was younger, she actually used to visit this property. It's where she used to ride her horses when she was younger. So, I mean, there's this crazy connection that we have had with this property for such a long time. And it was crazy to see it come full circle.
So it was 350 acres. It had been in the bank had owned it because of some non-payment of a loan by the previous people. And so we were able to get it fairly reasonable. And it had property on both sides of the highway there. And if you have been to Klein, or if you haven't, directly across the street from Klein in 2000, we started making jacuzzi wines because I wanted to honor my grandfather and his heritage. And that was sometime in around
90s, yeah.
late 1990s. And then we decided that, at some point we should open another winery, just really honoring his type of, his heritage. And it's really the Italian heritage. And was, by the way, since my mother was born, when my mother was born, both my grandparents, her parents, were not American citizens. They were Italian citizens. So because of that, I was able to get dual citizenship with Italy, and so did all of my children. So it's pretty unique to be able to go over there as a citizen as well and see what Italy's all about. But we decided in 2005 to open a winery called Jacuzzi, and we tried to build it very similar to what some of the buildings back in the old country looked like. And in 2007, which is in 1907, my grandfather was the first of his family to come over here. And in 2007, we opened this winery, had our grand opening, and my grandfather's parents, would be my great-grandparents, were the last bloodlines of their family. If they didn't have children, that whole bloodline would be gone. Well, they had 11 children. My grandfather was the second oldest. Then my grandfather had 8 children. And then, my parents had 9 children, and I couldn't let that just be the same. So my wife and I have 7 children, and Megan's right smack dab in the middle.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So she's our middle child, and she's been great.
Thanks, Dad. No, and I think such a cool part of the history is that, you learn so much from your grandfather out in Oakley, and it's really a tribute to him. And, they have a crazy history beyond just winemaking, and, it's the jacuzzi pump, and but they did a lot more than just the classic jacuzzi, your modern day hot tub. It was a lot of, they got into aviation, agriculture. It's really an interesting history. So I will stop sharing that screen. And I think it's time to get into some fun wine drinking. I know you're all ready for some wine. So Charlie, I would love for you to, give just a brief overview of the 3 wines that we are going to try today, and then maybe jump right into our Nancy's Cuvee.
Okay, well, we're going to taste Fred talked about his grandpa in Oakley there and his heritage in Oakley, and still about 40% of our grapes come from Oakley in Contra Costa County. So two of the wines we're going to taste today are from there. One being our Ancient Vine Carignan, and the next being our Big Break Grenache, and we'll go into those a little bit more as we taste them. The first wine we're going to start with is a wine that comes from the new property that Fred and Nancy moved to in the late 80s, where the winery is located now, which is about an hour north of San Francisco in the southern part of the Sonoma Valley in a region called Carneros. Carneros has got the Pacific Ocean to the west, and it's got the San Pablo Bay to the south, so it gets a lot of cooling influence there. So grape varieties that do really well are things that don't require a lot of sunshine, things like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And, Fred was brave enough to plant Syrah, which generally takes a lot of heat to ripen up. But when you grow it in a cool region, you develop lots of pepper characters and boysenberry. So we've got a wonderful Carneros Syrah too, and a bunch of other things. But before we jump into this Nancy's Cuvee, let's talk a little bit about the 2018 vintage, because all three wines we're going to taste today are the 2018 vintage. So in 2017, remember, it was a pretty wet year. So all the lakes and the reservoirs pretty much got filled up. But then December of 2017 came along, and all the way through February, it was really dry. We didn't get much rain at all. And it was warm. On February, I've got my notes on February 18th, on February 9th, it was 76 degrees. So it was warm. Things looked like they were going to bud out early. There was a lot of water in the ground, so we were growing everything. Weeds were growing, the vines were growing pretty well. But then in March, April, and June, it rained 27 times. Not huge rains, but enough rain that it's like, holy cow, we're getting some rain. And it remained cool. And it remained pretty cool for the growing season. And then we got to October 1, and we had an inch and a half of rain, which toward the end of the season is kind of spooky. You've got those grapes out there, they're a little vulnerable to rot and other things. But following October 1, on October 8th, it was 87 degrees. Everything ripened up. And that year, 2018, turned out to be beautiful, but it also turned out to be the largest harvest in California history. California picked 4.3 million tons of wine grapes. So it was the largest crop in California history. And so we're gonna taste three of the products of the 2018 vintage. The first thing is, and I hope we all have a glass of our Nancy's Cuvee. So this is the 2018 Nancy's Cuvee. This is the 10th year we've made. This is our 10th anniversary. It's 100% estate fruit, which means the winery owns and controls the fruit here and it's all Carneros, it's the fruit surrounding the winery here. It's 78% Chardonnay and it's 22% Pinot Noir. So it's a blend of those two, and you're always looking for some contribution from the different varietals for that blend. So the Chardonnay, we get a citrus and an apple character out of it. But Pinot Noir is a red grape, right? And this isn't a pink wine or a red wine. Sometimes a little bit of Pinot Noir, we bring that in and we treat it just like a white wine, which means we squeeze the skins we squeeze the grapes and get the juice away from the skins really before it picks up any color at all. So it's a combination. It adds a hint of tannin to the blend. So you get the citrus, you got the neat apple, but then you also get a little bit of texture and some red berry fruit from that Pinot Noir. And that's why those two are traditionally blended together for sparkling wine. You pick them early because a sparkling wine goes through two fermentations. First, we picked that Chardonnay and we picked that Pinot Noir. And in this case, we picked it really pretty early. We picked it in late August, early September, where if we were making those varieties for a table wine, we'd end up picking them 2 or 3 weeks later. So we pick them early when they don't have as much sugar, because that sugar converts into alcohol. So it's very light bodied, it's called the Cuvee, that blend. And it's that blend that you then add a little bit more sugar and yeast to after it's gone through that first fermentation, and you put it in a bottle and you put a beer cap on top of it. And so as that fermentation starts again and that sugar gets converted into carbon dioxide and alcohol, that it's capped. So you've got that CO2 is being created in that bottle. So it's called method champenois. It's making each bottle of sparkling wine within its own little bottle. The trick is then when you get to the point where you're going to put a label on it, you're going to finish it up, you've got that yeast in the bottle, but it's been necked down. You stick it in the freezer and it freezes that little plug of yeast and sediment in the neck there, and then it pops out. And when that pops out, you add back a little bit of water and a little bit of sugar, and that's called the dosage. And you can either finish it sweeter or you can finish it drier. The story of the name is, and Fred will remember this one, Fred and Megan's mom, Nancy, were at the tasting. Me and my wife, Nancy, was at the tasting. The two Nancys got together and they determined that we wanted to make this wine style. We wanted to make it dry. So this sparkling wine you've got in front of you is only 0.8% residual sugar. Most California sparklers are closer to 1.2% residual sugar. So the beauty of this blend, and I think we probably call it a brut for dry, is that it's drier. It's bright. The fruit is right there, and it's been great fun for the, like I said, 10 years, and we're continuing to make it.
So Charlie, I have a couple of questions. One, have we always made the same blend? So mostly Chardonnay with a little bit of Pinot, or have we switched it up?
It's ranged from like 74% to 78% Chardonnay, but it's always been Chardonnay and Pinot. Sometimes the birds were threatening to eat a bunch of our Chardonnay at another vineyard, and Fred would say, hey, maybe we ought to think about picking this other one early before the birds get it for sparkling wine. So I think there's a few years where we've made it and it's been Sonoma Coast instead of Carneros, but it's been Carneros for the last number of years. So stylistically, it's been very similar year to year.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to note that this is Carneros because Carneros is most well known probably for its sparkling wine. We have a number of sparkling houses that are in the Carneros region, like Gloria Ferrar, which is right down the street, and what's the Domaine Chandon.
Yeah.
And that's really what it is most well known for. And Charlie, like you were saying, it's an area that's really suited to growing those varieties that don't need as much sunlight. So Pinot Noir, Chardonnay do really, really well there. So, talking a little bit about the flavor, I do get a lot of that like sweeter citrus, kind of like a tangerine character right on the nose, and that apple that you were talking about from the Chardonnay. But there's also this like toasty element to it. Can you talk a little bit, Charlie, about lees aging and where you might get some of that like toasty bread character that I really love in sparkling wine? I think it's kind of a nod to champagne, and I really love it in this. Just a little bit of that toastiness.
Yeah, that's I think a key element in Chardonnay too, Megan, or in sparkling wine. And remember, I told you that we've got the Cuvee in a bottle, and there's sugar and yeast added to that. And when that yeast finishes the fermentation, it dies and it drops it's in that bottle. And as it degrades a little bit, it gives up, you call the sediment lees, L-E-E-S. And so when a wine is sur lie, it's on those lees. And as that yeast sort of decomposes a bit, it gives off that wonderful toasty aroma. So the longer you leave the sparkling wine on its sur lie, and some famous producers will leave it on there, in excess of 2 years, you pick up a bit more of that toasty element. Ours sits sur lie 7 to 9 months typically. And so it gets a little bit of that toast. You get some of that toast, but it's really nice because it's kind of subtle in there, but it's still that kind of traditional yeast flavor, which is wonderful. It's like toasted bread.
Yeah, completely. No, I really love that kind of hint of it in this wine. I also just I didn't say this earlier, but I want to make sure you guys know, ask questions at any point. If you have any questions or any comments on the wine, if you enjoy it, if you have great pairings, please let me know. Type it in the chat, and I'll pose it to Charlie and I, and we'll do our best to answer. But
we don't make a lot of this wine. Excuse me, Megan.
No, sorry, go ahead.
We don't make a lot of this wine either. I mean, it's typically around 800 cases or so. So it's a small production.
Yeah. And I do want to say part of the reason we chose this wine for November is because it's such a good holiday pairing wine. And I don't know about you guys, 2020 for me has been the longest year, but for somehow we're already at the holidays. I can't believe it. I can't believe Thanksgiving is right around the corner. But I think this is such a good wine to either just like drink on its own, or pair with things like appetizers, or we have a really great recipe online, which is like a crostini with ricotta and dates, and it goes so well with that. I've made it a couple times, and I think, yeah, again, like I said, easy to. Oh, really? Love it. Yes. Oh my God, that's amazing. We have Matthew. Yes, you're on it. How does it pair? Good. Yes. Great. I love it. So, yeah, if anyone else has any great pairings with this, I think it goes really well with all sorts of things. And I'll put the recipe here in the chat so you guys can all.
Yeah, there's either always a bottle in our refrigerator or it's nearby the refrigerator.
Yeah. So yeah, would love to hear anyone else's comments, but I think it's a great wine, Charlie. And ooh, popcorn. Someone said pairing this with popcorn. I'm all about that. Okay, so we have a question, Charlie, that said, did 2020 fires harm your winemaking? And
2020 fires?
Yeah. So
yeah,
go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's something we're certainly concerned with. The fires were distant enough. They say that really the key thing is how fresh was the smoke and how close were you to the smoke. So if you were a 24-hour wind event away from getting your smoky vineyard, you're better off than if you were right next to it. And we were far enough away in most cases that we're looking pretty good. We're not picking up any smoke taint in any of our wines, but we're working with labs in St. Helena. We're working with a lab in New Orleans that can look for all the different elements of smoke taint, and we're getting those results back. And we're going to take a good hard look at all of that stuff. And our key concern is that we release nothing that would be a compromise of quality at all. So all I can say is it's unfolding. It's one of those things where the smoke gets through the skins and it attaches to sugar. And when it's attached to the sugar, when it's bound, you can't really taste the character of the smoke. It's after the fermentation where the sugar decouples from the smoke element where it becomes obvious. So it's kind of a time sensitive thing. So we're testing and tasting everything post fermentation. And so far we're looking really good.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's definitely been an interesting year. The fires were just the cherry on top, I think, and with all of the challenges that we've all been dealing with, that was hard. But like Charlie said, our goal is to make sure we're releasing the best wines possible. So it's all about tasting and testing, and yeah, it's definitely been a process, but we are definitely committed to making.
It's been, you guys are probably from all over the place, but it's been dry out here in California, this year, big time. So we're expecting our first rain event on Friday, and we're very, very excited about that. We've cleaned out the rain gutters in anticipation.
Yeah. Charlie, we have another question that asks, with clones of Chardonnay and Pinot.
Hey, Fred, I mean, we've got a lot of clone 4 out there, Chardonnay, you've got John clones.
And then a lot of heritage clones of the Pinot, which is just like old California Pinot Noir, where we don't, and then some Dijon as well. So some of that 667.
Most of the Chardonnay around the winery, there's only one block of clone 4, but most of it's Dijon at the winery itself.
Yeah, I think we have either close to 10 different Pinot Noir clones spread around too, and rootstock. So it's Fred planted a pretty good plethora of different clones and rootstocks to bring some complexity to the blends.
Yeah. We also got someone pairing this with chicken wings, and I have to say that sounds like an amazing pairing.
It'd kind of be hard to go wrong pairing this with stuff. I mean, right acidity, good fruit. Even try an artichoke if you're brave.
Yeah, and I think that's a good thing to mention. I know you said that we picked these early, and part of that is to preserve that brightness that everyone, and that acidity, that juiciness that everyone wants in a sparkling wine. So I think you did a good job of capturing that. It's really fresh. The bubbles are really nice. Overall, great wine. With that, I think we're ready to move on to wine number 2. And so everyone, pour a glass of your ancient vine Carignan. And while you do that, I think we can talk a little bit about the Rhone Rangers, because we didn't talk about that earlier. And I actually do think that's a big part of your history, Dad. And but back in the day, people weren't really making single varietal Rhone wines, things like Carignan, things like Mourvedre, and things like, well, people were making Syrah, but Viognier, Marsanne, Roussanne. And my dad was one of the original members of the Rhone Rangers, a group of people who are really promoting these Rhone varieties all across California, all across the US. And you've been making Carignan as a single varietal for, I mean, early 80s.
Correct.
Yeah. And so it's really interesting. I think a lot of people use Carignan as a blending grape. So you don't find too many that are single varietal Carignan. So I think, yeah.
I could address a little bit of that. So when I first started the winery in Oakley, I didn't have more than a very small amount of grapes being grown on our ranch. So I started going around the community in Oakley and talking to these old farmers that mostly Italian, Portuguese were the main ones. And there were immigrants just like my grandfather. There'd be the second or third generation. And they had been selling to wineries like that Furple winery that was out there. And a lot of them were selling that way to just the local wineries because there was a lot. But there was, when Prohibition hit, it caused a big problem because there couldn't be wineries making wine and selling it. So what they kind of transitioned to was to shipping these grapes all across the United States to places like New York, New Jersey, even Canada, Chicago, to people that were mostly from the old country that wanted to make their own wines. And so they started making their own wines because you could legally do that during Prohibition. If that was part of your heritage, they couldn't stop you. And even though, some people did a little bit more than that, you could do 200 gallons for your family use. And so, so these grapes were being shipped all over, and it continued even by the time in the 80s, they were still doing a lot of that. There was a few places that sold to wineries, but it was very few, and mostly almost everything out of that area was being shipped. And these were being put in boxes, 36-pound boxes, put on, one originally was put on rail cars to get to the East Coast. Then by the time I actually shipped some grapes, because I'd buy the whole vineyard, the production of the whole vineyard, and I couldn't use it all. So I would ship some too. And you'd put it in these 35, 40-foot containers, refrigerated containers. And you just had to pray that they made it to their destination without spoiling, because I mean, it takes 3 or 4 days, generally a week, to get to where they're going to be used. And so there's a few times that I don't know if I can believe it or not, but the trucker said that, or the broker that you use said that they didn't make it all right, and I didn't get paid. So I wanted to get away from that as much as I could, as soon as I could, and eventually I was able to. And partly the way I was able to do it was to start selling to other vintners that I was introducing them to the wines from the area, the grapes from the area, the grapes of Carignan, grapes Mourvedre, which is pretty much our signature wine that we make red at Klein, was also known as Mataro, and it was used in France, used in Spain, used in Portugal, and so a lot of people like Randall Graham, who had Bonnie Doon, he was one of my first big customers of selling grapes to. And
I think it's really cool. I feel like it really started a movement of people, discovering these wines from California versus where, European labels maybe don't say the varietal. So people don't know exactly what maybe is in certain bottles from Europe. So it's cool to that you were a huge part of that.
So we pretty much started a group, but it was interesting. We're all pretty much were rebels and we're independents, and we didn't really want to have this big organization. So we just met and we kept ourselves informed, but between each other. But we didn't have a formal group. We didn't have any real organization to it until later, and then when it became more of a business for everyone. And but what kind of started um, the kind of the really getting solidified was with Robert Parker, who was one of the top wine, what would you call him, a wine
Raider or writer.
Yeah, wine critic, wine writer.
He came out every month with a different reviews of the wines he tasted. And so he wanted to taste what was happening in California with all these basically mostly young winemakers, but not all. But he asked for submissions, and so we submitted our wines as well as all these other people. I think it was in '88. It came out in like the fall of '88, and it was pretty much on 87 wines. And of course, we had not been selling a lot of wine back then, but when these ratings came out and the scores that he gave our wines, it changed our whole business.
Yeah, it's crazy, like the big impacts that wine writers have and had on wines, and like, yeah, what a big difference that makes.
It was even to the point where I got visited by the Perrin brothers, and the Perrin brothers owned the Chateauneuf-du-Pape, the Rhone Winery, and their families owned it for, I don't know, 200 or 300 years. What I did fail to mention, the vineyards that are out in Oakley right now they're over 120 to 140 years old. But when I started, they were only like about 80 to 100 year old.
Yeah.
So these are old vines. They don't produce a huge amount, but the intensity and the quality of these grapes are just spectacular. So I got visited by the Perrin brothers out in Oakley, and I think they were kind of looking around going, oh, because this winery was not a fancy winery at all. It was our first tasting room was a single wide mobile trailer that was used as a bank at some construction site, and I converted it and got a lot of landscaping and took the two bulletproof windows that were in the front and made tables out of them and had a little tasting area. But it was a humble beginning, but it really taught me a lot about people. I'll tell you one quick story. When I first opened up, I tasted wine with all the customers that came in. Not that there was a lot, but and after like a day, half the day was gone when I started doing it, and it was just I had already drank too much that day, and so I had to realize I could not drink with everyone, even though I wanted to. I thought it's a very sociable way to deal with wine, but
I still do that.
Yeah, you can do a little bit.
That's where the days are going.
Not with every customer coming in. So anyway, the Perrins were interested, but they ended up choosing a different area. They moved down to Paso Robles area.
Topless Creek?
And that's Topless
Yes,
Creek.
okay.
And
Yeah.
It was mainly because their handler, I'll call, which was their importer at the time, did not think Oakley was a very good area to have a winery, which they probably were right. The vineyards are there.
Yeah, the vineyards are incredible. But let's jump into the wine. Thank you, Dad.
Okay.
Charlie, I would love to hear your process, and you can talk more to the ancient vines like that.
Back to the talking about the shipping, Fred shipping that wine to the East Coast. If you go back earlier when rail really was the way to go, see that picture in the background? I think that's an old Mourvedre vineyard. That raise and that rail at the top, that is the railroad track. That's an intercontinental railroad. And having that railroad in Oakley or pass through Oakley gave them a competitive advantage in addition to the grapes in Oakley ripen up, a month before they do in Sonoma and Napa. So they were able to ship that stuff back to the East Coast in mass, and that railroad went a long way to doing that before the refrigerated rail cars and things, or the refrigerated trucks came along. Yeah. Okay. So in looking at and talking about our ancient vine Carignan here, there's another bit of history is the ranch that Fred is talking about where he spent a lot of time with his grandpa. And his grandpa, I think, Fred, you told me that your grandpa bought that thing in 1924 and it was 100 acres. It had Carignan on it. So not only, is there a lot of Carignan grown in the place, but Fred's grandpa bought a ranch that they were growing Carignan and it was selling for $30 a ton. And a ton makes about 70 cases of wine. So you're not going to get it for $30 a ton now, but that's a little bit of history there. So the vineyard, the wine we're tasting right now, this is 100% Carignan. Like Megan was saying, it's typically blended, but because we've got these old, low-yielding vineyards, and they'll yield between 1 to 3 tons of grapes, which isn't a lot. The vine really focuses, knowing that it doesn't have a lot of nutrients, knowing that it doesn't have a lot of moisture. It'll focus on ripening its fruit. Now, these vines, there's 5 different vineyards that contribute to the wine you're tasting right now. And they were planted between 1900 and 1945. Contra Costa County, Oakley, where this is coming from, you can see how sandy the soil is in the background there. It's in the southern part, it's just south of California's 2 large rivers, the Sacramento and the San Joaquin, and it's in that Sacramento River Delta area, so it gets the cool breezes. But the proximity to those rivers, deposited literally, our vineyard manager, Alan Lucchesi, says there's 30 feet of sand out there. And when he's used backhoes to uproot some of these old vines, he's seen how deep that root can penetrate through that easily permeable sand. But the sand is not very nutritious. But they're all dry farmed. You don't see any irrigation lines going to these old vines. And they only get 14 inches of rain a year out there, but yet it's enough to sustain these vines. They've shown a little lower crop as we weathered the multiple year drought, but they seem to hang in there. So we've got the deep sand. Another amazing thing about these grapes is that they're on their own rootstock. They're on the rootstock that is.
They're not on a rootstock, Charlie.
Huh?
They're not on
their own
rootstock. They're
rootstock.
just cuttings.
They're on their own rootstock.
Yeah.
Not grafted, in other words, to like most grapes planted in California are grafted to rootstock that is resistant to certain bugs. And one of those bugs is a root louse called phylloxera that you guys have all heard about. Phylloxera will kill a vine and then it'll walk to the next vine, walk through the checked and cracked soil and kill that one. Sandy soil, the thing can't migrate through. So Fred has got these grapes that were planted, turn of the last century, and they've survived phylloxera because phylloxera doesn't do well in that sand. It can't move from vine to vine. So we picked these grapes. Grapes like Carignan and Zinfandel and Mourvedre, Grenache love Oakley because Oakley is warm during the day. It's warm to hot during the day, but then it cools off at night. So the wine hangs on to the nice acidity levels. And certain grape varieties like Carignan need a lot of heat to ripen up. So they do really well there.
So Charlie, you actually just answered a question that we got in the chat from Ken, and he said the wine has really good acidity. How do you retain that in such a warm climate? And I think to what you just said, even though Oakley is such a warm, hot climate, it does have that diurnal shift. So at night, the temperatures drop, you're able to keep that acidity in there.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of Carignan is it naturally has a fair amount of acidity, and why it's used as a blending grape around the world, even though ours is 100% Carignan, is the yield tends to be pretty good. So good acidity, good color, and good yield. And when it's grown in a limited growing environment, you just get these wonderful flavors of strawberry and there's almost some plum in there, and there's a little bit of tobacco. It just makes a really interesting wine. But so we bring grapes into the winery. They're all hand picked. One of the things about trying to grow and deal with a vine that's behind my head there is you don't use a machine on these things. It's all hand labor. So it's really expensive. So consequently, so many old vines have been yanked out of the ground because you make a lot more money planting houses than you do growing grapes. And you don't get a huge yield for the amount of money you have to spend on it. One thing I think Fred and his family has done is they've preserved these old vines, or a lot of other folks might say, hey, make that thing a housing development. But we've preserved these old vines, so they're really treasures. So you're tasting a wine that there's just not a lot of ancient vine Carignan out there, certainly in California, that's 100% Carignan. So we bring it into the wine, we hand pick it, it's shipped into the winery, which is about an hour away. We crush it, and when you crush it, we actually de-stem it. There's something where you've got, our crusher stemmer's got rollers, and if you keep them together, as they roll, they'll squish the berries, but we pull them apart so they drop into a destemmer because we don't want to grind up the seeds and the skins because it can contribute a bitter element. We really wanted to make a smooth wine, so we destem it. It then pumped to a tank, and with a red wine, you leave the skins in contact with the juice, unlike a white wine where you'd separate the skins from the juice immediately. And we don't add any yeast to this. So this is a native fermentation. So the fermentation will start, a couple days after we pump the must, which is the skins and the juice and the seeds into there, and it'll ferment along. And then we'll taste it every day, and we'll taste it because as time progresses, it's almost like making tea. You're extracting tannin, that mouth puckering element that you get from the skins and the seeds and the stems. You're extracting that from the grape. And if you over extract that, you have to come back later and get rid of it. And you get rid of it by using something called a fining agent, where you'd add a protein like a gelatin, or you guys have heard about egg white fining or isinglass, and that attaches to those tannins and drops it out. We do something different. When it starts to get, what we feel is when it establishes the right amount of tannin, we'll press it, even if there's a little sugar left in it, and the sugar will ferment out later in whatever tank we press into. So we don't have to go back and find this wine. So our wines are all vegan friendly. There's no animal products at all used in making our wine. So that's one of the things we do.
Okay, Charlie, before you go on, we have a couple questions, and actually two of them are kind of similar, and it's talking about comparing this wine to one our heritage Zin and then one our ancient vine Zin. And I think there are some similarities. Just in terms of like tannin structure. I think you get kind of this, at least for me, and then Charlie, I'll have you speak to it from your perspective as well. But for me, I get really similar tannin structure in all of the ancient vine wines. So including the heritage, including the ancient vine Zinfandel and the ancient vine Carignan, I get this like dusty, really fine tannin. And I attribute that to the sandy soil. And I don't know if that's right, but because I get that same consistency through all the wines from Oakley, that's kind of where I'm putting that. But I would say this compared to those Zinfandels is a little bit more secondary note driven. So Charlie was talking more about, the tobacco and I really get more of that in this wine right away than I do with our Zinfandels, where I tend to get more of that strawberry, that red fruit, and a little bit more of that ripeness. Here I get more of that darker fig, dark plum. And Charlie, I would love to hear your thoughts as well.
I think you're right on, Megan. There's a bunch of things that influence the flavor of a wine, and the variety is one of the things. Like Zinfandel is known for tasting like strawberries. That's why all that white Zinfandel was like a strawberry soda pop. It was so very popular. And Cabernet Sauvignon is more like, you get more of a blackberry note, and then maybe some green olive note. And for Carignan, I think Megan, you hit it with some of that plum, but it's not saying you can even tell them apart necessarily all the time, because there's a lot of similarities. Where you pick the grape, the amount of sugar it's got that it comes in with converts directly into how much alcohol the wine is going to have, which affects the weight of it too. So if you've got a Zinfandel and a Carignan and you pick them at the same level, so the mouthfeel is the same, the weightiness is the same, and then you press them so that the tannin levels are similar, you're going to have kind of a similar tasting wine, except with the Carignan, I think you're going to get a bit more of that plum. So the Zinfandel, we always look for strawberry and a really nice spice we seem to get out of those vineyards. And with the Carignan, there's the bit of strawberry, but there's also that neat plum and kind of tobacco element too. And then you see differentiation by the kind of oak you're going to use. Like this is a French oak, and we try not to overpower the wine with oak. Oak will contribute, if it's an American oak, it might contribute more vanilla, and you might even get a molasses character because they toast the oak, which caramelizes the wood sugars, and that contributes a certain caramel character to the wine. So French oak is a little different. It's a little more complex. You might get different spices and things. So this is this guy is a French oak. So yeah, there's huge variation from year to year too. You might get one year that's just more tannic than another year.
So we have another question, and I think my dad said that he can answer this. And the question is, many early Italian wine pioneers made wine from field blends. were any of the Oakley vineyards planted that way? So Dad, I know you can
I
speak
can
to this.
answer that, but I also can answer Ken's question about the acidity as well, because one thing that happens out in Oakley, and I know this from living out there, is that pretty much every night we get this fog that rolls in because we're right next to the delta. We're in the delta area, so that fog that comes in to the San Francisco Bay pretty much every evening that we experience in Carneros here, it does go up there, and it actually cools. The nights cool down up there, and I know that because I slept on a lounge chair outside for many years when I was with my grandmother, because it would be so hot inside the house, but if you slept outside, it cooled down, and then it got actually cold. So and we weren't very close to where the river was. We're actually where the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers meet is where Oakley is, and it's that confluence there that has that coolness, that really brings that coolness at night there. In the day it's hot,
Yeah.
but in the evening and night it really cools down. And then the other question about there were some vineyards that were planted blendedly. I mean,
Yeah, with like Palomino and
yeah, there was a lot of different vines in the same block, but usually they could be separated fairly easily. They just weren't mixed out in the vineyard. There would be maybe 5 rows of Palomino,
Mourvedre, and then Mourvedre.
Yeah, there would be a lot of different varieties, but they weren't like mixed in the vineyard. Like you just wouldn't go out and plant anything in, because these were all in sand, and they're no trellis. They're just either some were 10 by 10 spacing, some were 5 by 7, but or not even 5 by 7, not in the sand. But the reason is that sand's 25 feet deep at minimum, and there's actually water at 25 feet deep. I was there when the county was bringing a drainage line through our vineyard, and we had to take out vines, and they dug this huge deep ditch, and at the bottom there was a little bit of water down there, but there was roots all the way to the bottom in this sand.
Pretty incredible.
Yeah.
And so I think when people talk about field blends, it's probably a big block that, like you said, has 5 rows of this, and then they just pick everything at the same time and make it into one wine, and that's what they call a field blend.
Yeah.
Okay, we got another question that said, which one of these wines will pair best with chocolate? Okay, so in my opinion, I think the Carignan actually, I think it has that darker, richer character compared to the Grenache, but you also get, I think that's what I would go with, but I'll have to test it out after this.
Yeah, that sounds like a fun experiment.
Yeah. All right, so Ken also asked, who selected Carignan and Mourvedre, which are mostly French and Spanish grapes to plant out there? I think it probably, like you said, Italian, Portuguese, and Spanish immigrants.
But you have to know, when I grew up out there, it wasn't considered Mourvedre, which is
Mataro, right?
It's known as Mataro, which is the Spanish.
Yeah, and same with Carignan. I think they make a lot of Carignan in Spain as well. So I would say probably more Spanish immigrants
But there was a lot of different communities out there. Italians were pretty big, but there was also even German out there. It was, this was the time at that turn of the century when between the 1800s and 1900s, there was a lot of immigrants, and they all brought their different flavors and likes to the country, and it's really what's made this such a great country.
Yeah. So I have a question, and Charlie, I don't know if you know the answer to this or you do. Are there different clones of Carignan? I mean.
Yeah, there are different clones of Carignan. Now we have a heritage clone, but I don't know which one it is.
Yeah, interesting. All right.
Yeah, I was in that Carignan panel, and they were talking about different clones of Carignan at the Plant Foundation operation there at UC Davis.
I love it. Well, I'll have to look into it. We answered that. All right. So with that, I think we can. One last thing I want to say, part of the reason that we chose this wine is that we also have a really great recipe for Thanksgiving. And I just sent it out to everyone in the chat, and it's these really delicious cranberry and brie holiday bites. I think it's a great wine to pair with anything with sort of like red fruit, you know, match that brightness of the acidity to things that have a little bit of acid as well. So anything with tomato, anything with things like cranberry. So I think that's great. If you get a chance, make that. They're really delicious. But I would also love to hear what you guys would pair with this wine. And with that, I think we make sure you pour yourself a glass of the Big Break Grenache, and we'll move on to our third wine of the night.
Is that my cue?
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So third wine, we are drinking our Big Break Grenache. This is also from Contra Costa County, and these vines are about 30 years old. So not those old ancient vines that we're talking about with the Carignan, but still from that area. And Charlie, yeah, take it away. Tell us a little bit about the Vineyard Big Break, what makes it kind of unique and special, and then our winemaking approach with this and our oak treatment, how long this is on oak, and yeah, your kind of defining characteristics of this wine.
Okay. So this is our Big Break Grenache. And it's interesting how Big Break Vineyard got its name, it being that it's adjacent to Big Break Road, and that whole Big Break area got its name because a levee broke 85 years ago and it flooded this guy's asparagus field, and they left it flooded, and it became the Big Break Regional Shoreline Park now, where supposedly some equipment that was used, and maybe Fred's got a little more information on this, that was used in the construction of the Panama Canal, they dumped it in this bay, and it's become home to all sorts of fish species you don't normally find. So what was a asparagus field has turned into the Big Break Regional Shoreline, and our vineyard is next to it. That's how close we are to this, to some of the Sacramento Delta area here. So like Megan said, this Grenache was planted 30 years ago. They think that Garnacha originated in Spain. It's grown literally worldwide. China's got plantings of it now. Mexico's got planting of it. They grow it in Sardinia, and they call it Cananao. It's often blended. It's usually, you've heard of GSMs, which are Grenache, Syrah, and Mourvedre blends. This Grenache is 100% Grenache. And our philosophy is generally, if you can make a blend that doesn't have holes in it and it can retain 100% varietal, well, we'll do it. So many of our Zinfandels are 100% varietal. The Carignan was 100% varietal. Mourvedre is 100% varietal. This Grenache is 100% varietal. If we felt that it needed more color or tannin or pepper or something else, we might blend something different into it. But as a standalone, it does really well, I think, as 100% Grenache. Again, Grenache can look like that vine behind me. They can be huge vines that have huge yields. Ours, in this limited soil with the limited water, we get maybe 3 tons per acre off of that thing. Where a vineyard, if you grow Grenache in real fertile soils with all the water it wants, hell, you could get 12 tons per acre off of that stuff, but then you lose concentration. So one of the interesting aspects of this wine is, from such low yielding vineyards, you get good color and you get lots of good fruit. And the fruit I get out of this thing is more of a sour cherry and a little bit of a raspberry character and spice too.
Yeah, and Charlie, so we're getting a couple comments that they taste a little bit of mint. So if you could talk a little bit about why Big Break would taste a little minty. And
sure. Okay, within this vineyard, we have some eucalyptus trees. Eucalyptus, where they're planted as windbreaks or for beautification throughout California and stuff. But interestingly enough, the eucalyptus tree, you've either got that eucalyptus mint character, that essential oil, it's called 2,3-cineol, and it's either carried by the wind and finds its way to the grapes. But the Australians came up with the idea that, well, you know what, you're not getting all of that from the windborne oils, they said that you'll see leaf particles and things that get trapped within the canopy and within the grapes, and those act as a tea bag, and they can flavor the wine heavily too. So the part of that neat sort of exotic mint you're getting out of this is its proximity to some eucalyptus trees that are on that vineyard, and that's been a signature of this wine for a long time. But this is hand-picked. It comes into the winery. It too goes through a native fermentation, so we don't add any yeast to this. It ferments all by itself. We cap the temperature. We've got an ideal temperature where we feel we pull out the tannins and the fruit flavors. The tannins and the fruit flavors, but we want to eliminate, if you ferment it too cold, you might not get the fruit, you might get a little bit more of that green character. The nice thing is out in Contra Costa County, you don't get a lot of that green fruit character. So we do cap the temperature, let it go through its fermentation, taste it every day, and we press it. We feel we have the right amount of tannin. So again, with this wine, we don't do any fining at all. There's no protein fining agents added to it. So it is vegan friendly also.
Yeah. So, okay, really quickly, Kevin mentioned Topolos Winery. He says it's long gone, had grapes near eucalyptus trees, and the taste of the trees were there as well. So yeah. I don't know Topolos.
With one of their kids.
Oh, okay. Well, but where was Topolos? Was it Sonoma?
No, it was Sonoma County.
Sonoma County.
Do you remember Topolos, Charlie?
Yeah, I remember Mike Topolos. I think he might have been Russian River Valley or something.
Yeah, he was.
Yeah, but I think the most famous, if you guys want to talk about Mac's eucalyptus character, if you fall back to Heights Martha's Vineyard there in Napa County, he was the ultimate eucalyptus character, where it's a really distinctive mint, and you get a lot of that. You still get that out of a lot of Australian wines and things. Yeah. And I think it can be a really interesting component in a wine, a signature as it is. So we do another wine called Small Berry Mourvedre, and it also has a little bit of that eucalyptus character to it too. And sometimes our Big Break Zinfandel does also. Yeah, it's definitely a signature of this vineyard. And I do think this wine has a little bit of a bigger body. And yeah, Frank and I were kind of talking about why we chose this order to present the wines in. Why the Carignan before the Grenache? And to me, it had this bigger body. It's just a little bit more robust and a little bit more fruit driven. So maybe I think it's a dry wine, but it's more like sweet fruit presenting. So I like to taste it after a wine that's a little bit more secondary note driven. So a little bit more of that earthy character. But I do get more of that red fruit. But juicy red fruit and a little bit more ripe, like really ripe strawberry, not like raspberry jam, I would say. No, I think you're right. I think it was a perfect order. The weight of this wine, this is close to 15% alcohol wine. And if you guys remember, I mean, when we talk about sugar in a wine, you use a Brix as a measurement system. And so Brix is percent soluble solids. And so of that, most of that is sugar, and then you've got other dissolved acids and things. And so if you figure if the wine is one Brix converts into 0.6% alcohol. So if you pick the thing at 25 degrees Brix, multiply that by 0.6, you're going to find out how much alcohol you've got in the wine. The alcohol does a couple things. It provides the weightiness in this wine. So although you're not picking up, or at least I'm not picking up the hot alcohol character, this wine can handle it pretty well. There's a certain weightiness to this wine, but also it provides a certain compound or a certain characteristic we call sucrosity, which is a little bit of a sweet element to it too. So even though it doesn't come up like Megan said, it's a dry wine, there's a certain sweetness to the fruit in this wine. But this thing could handle anything you want to throw at it in terms of if you want to do ribs or black and dahi or things with big flavors. A wine like this is going to handle those big flavors. I included this wine in this tasting because I thought it was good, like, some of the appetizers and like things like cranberry sauce for the Nancy's Cuvee and the Carignan, and then this would go with any of the meat courses, the big red meat courses. So I, like, in my mind, I was thinking lamb, because of that mintiness, you like that mint with lamb, and I think this would go really, really well with that. And we only made 600 cases, so it's not a big production wine either. And this was 100%, well, what we call 38% new, the equivalent of 38% went into new barrels, American oak. So that's where you find that little bit of that vanilla and a little of that sweet molassesy character too.
Yeah. And I do have to say, like you said, it's 15% alcohol. I personally tend to like some of the lower alcohol wines, but I don't taste that high alcohol in this wine. I think it's really well balanced with the fruit, with the tannin, the structure's there to really like, it kind of masks that high alcohol, and you actually kind of need that to have the body that this wine does. And I can actually really appreciate that in this wine, where sometimes really high alcohol wines you can find out of balance.
That tan, oh, excuse me, Meg, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just gonna say, Ken said blend the two wines into a Languedoc blend, and I love that. So I might try it right now.
Yeah, it'd be a nice blend.
Tiffany says that lamb sounds like a great pairing, was thinking that too. And then we have Matthew, if we have time to go back to Nancy before you finish, did the recipe change a few years ago? Yes, we have another recipe, and I think it is this really delicious salad. Let me see if I can find it, and I will. I think, yeah, are you talking about the blend of the wine, the Pinot and Chardonnay balance, or a food recipe for the Nancy's Cuvee? But we did get a new recipe. Oh, the wine blend. Oh, thank you. So I think Charlie said that for the most part, we try and be very Chardonnay heavy on the Nancy's Cuvee, and that's really how it's always been. But Charlie, was there ever a year that we did more Pinot Noir than we did Chardonnay?
There was one year where we did less Pinot Noir. There was our biggest year for Chardonnay, kind of an outlier, was 2015, and it was 88% Chardonnay.
Okay, so it has always been Chardonnay heavy, just some of the percentages have changed.
It has.
But we did get a great new recipe for the Nancy's Cuvee as well. Yeah, I would love to hear any more questions, and what your thoughts are on the Grenache. But I think it's a great wine, Charlie, and like I said, like really hit the nail on the head with the balance between the fruit, the dark berry, and that structure. All right, Joanna says, what food pairing would you suggest for the Carignan? So I think, yeah, anything with a tomato base, because it has that acidity, I like pairing wines to either match or contrast the food that you're pairing them with. So I like for Carignan specifically, because it has that higher acidity, really nice brightness, I like to also pair it with something that has that bright character to it. So I would go anything with, so like call it pizza. I mean, I pair everything with pizza, but pizza and any red sauce like pastas I think would be great. And then, I sent along that cranberry brie recipe, these holiday bites. And again, it's that like bright acidity with the cranberries that's going to match really well with the brightness of the wine.
I think there's enough tannin is the stuff that it denatures the protein in your saliva. So you lose lubrication on your tongue. Well, that same tannin that we use as a skeleton of the wine that you can hang the fruit and everything else on is great when you're eating a fatty food because it cleaves right through it. Hence the red wine with meat. So say this Carignan has a good tannin structure, and it would be great with everything from a hamburger to a New York to any big flavorful food item.
Yeah. So, okay, we also have aging recommendations for both wines. So I'd love for you to speak to that.
Well, we were good enough to have it. We've got a pretty good library. So we've tasted both of these wines going back a ways, and they do hold up. I mean, if your cellar, it's kind of, you have to ask yourself the personal question, do you like younger wines or do you like older wines? And as a wine gets older, the fresh fruit character, that fresh cherry or strawberry or plum turns into dried fruit. And the oaky components might turn into kind of a grandma's cedar box complex character. So you have to ask yourself, do you like drinking wines that have got that fresh, bright fruit, or you like them to be aged out a little bit and be a little bit drier? And we tell people, hey, buy a case of it, drink a bottle a year and keep your notes, and you can figure out how long you want to age it. I'd say generally, you know, my preference is I'll generally drink a wine with these wines probably within 6 or 7 years of the vintage date, although they hold up just fine longer.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. And please, you guys, if there's any more questions, let us know. In the meantime, we haven't scheduled our December virtual tasting yet, but we will be putting that on the books soon. And I just want to thank you all for joining us. It's always super, super fun.
Why don't you ask them if they have certain wines they would like to be in?
Oh yeah, I mean, if you guys have favorite wines from us that you would love to have us go into a deeper dive into, like, please let us know. We will definitely put those up on the board, and we will be, yeah. We'll be sending out an email. We recorded this entire tasting, so if you want to revisit any of the wines and learn a little bit more about our history, the winemaking style, let us know. And just, yeah, thank you guys so much. It is really fun to connect virtually.
And we're open.
And we are open, yes. Yeah, I think that's great. We have been open since June, I believe. So if you're in the area, please come visit us, make a reservation. That's probably the easiest way to do it. And yeah, and I mean, Charlie, if you want to talk a little bit about what happens next in the vineyard. I mean, harvest is done for us. This is one of the earliest harvests that we've had, for sure, right?
Yeah, it was very early. Yeah, so right now all the leaves are of course dropping off, and we'll wait for that big freeze, and then we start the pruning operation once we've had a good freeze or two, and then it all starts again.
I love it. Well, again, thank you all. We'll be sending out an email with the invite for next month, and I hope you enjoyed the wines. And thank you, Dad, for being our special guest.
My pleasure. Especially, I mean, how could I not like sitting with all these beautiful people, drinking wine and talking about our project that we've started a long time ago, and having my beautiful daughter, a great winemaker, with us. And,
yeah.
And look, you guys, you know, can we do this longer? I mean, can we just go?
You guys just want to hang out, or?
Yeah.
Yes, I love it. Yeah, and so Renee, we haven't put our virtual tasting on the books yet for next month, but we will, and we'll send you out an email with all the information on where you can sign up and join us. And really, honestly, it's been great, and really appreciate you all, and enjoy your Wednesday. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome, guys.
Have a
Thanks
wonderful
again,
night.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Adios.
Bye-bye.